Hi everybody, this is a follow-up for the week 3 workshop. I'm going to run through the PowerPoint slides and the activities that we worked through during the week 3 workshop and give you some ideas of the responses that we came up with for the different activities. So under week 3 we can now find the PowerPoint. So that's the workshop slides down the bottom here. We started off by reviewing week 2, which was about unit planning. So the different layouts that we can have, how there's no one way that a unit plan can be set out. There are lots of different ways. How we can align a unit plan with the curriculum and the 3 different phases of a unit: the orientating, the enhancing, and the synthesizing. Please remember those in your unit plans. I think that's very important, and that will give you some ideas about the kinds of activities and learning experiences that you could suggest for each lesson across the unit, and making sure that the lessons are sequenced in a way that builds students' capacity to complete that assessment task. So last week was about unit planning. Remember that your assignment is due next Friday by email, and that's the same for both internal and external students. For the week 3 workshop, there are 3 learning goals, so 3 things that I want you to be able to do or understand by the end of the week. So the first is the principles behind lesson planning. So what goes into a good lesson plan and what we don't do when we're lesson planning. Secondly, evaluate the effectiveness of a lesson plan. I want you to be able to look at a lesson plan and pick holes in it if necessary, and to identify the strengths of a lesson plan. And lastly, I want you to be able to design a lesson plan. Obviously, you'll need to do that in your lesson plans for your assignment 1. And that's something very practical that you'll have to do in a few short weeks when you're out on prac, and of course in your teaching career. This workshop is designed to be very practical. There are lots of activities in here that you can use in your classroom. So as we go through, as you work through the slides, feel free to make a note of any activity ideas, or make sure that you save a copy of these slides and add some of the activities into your resource bank. They're quite generic activities that you could apply in just about any learning area, but they're just some different ideas to model to you how we can introduce new texts. That's the focus of those strategies today. So we start off with some solo thinking time. So just thinking to yourself, what do you think are the 2 most important factors when planning a lesson? So think to yourself, if it was your class and you're planning, what do you think the 2 most important factors are? So once you've had a think about that, if we were in class, we would then turn to our partner. We call them our elbow partner, so the person on either side of our elbows. And that's something that you could teach your students. They'll get to know who their elbow partners are. So with that partner, we discussed the 2 that we selected and why you selected them. In the workshop, these were the responses that we shared. So this was off the whiteboard. So having content was the first one. So it's important to have content. So we're not just sitting there in the classroom for 45 minutes. So having content, somebody suggested, was one of the most important things. Making sure that the lesson is aligned with the curriculum is obviously very important. An awareness of pedagogy. So having an awareness of how you're teaching and why you're teaching the way you are, and having a repertoire of strategies that you can pull from. Having resources that are logical, that make sense for the students, that apply to the phase of the unit that you're in, that are engaging. So in resources, that's a really important consideration. Making sure that the lesson is relevant to students, selling it to them as something that really does matter to them for whatever the reason might be. Being flexible in the lesson in terms of timing, so if an activity is taking longer than you thought, or it went quicker than you thought, in the techniques you might start an activity that you thought was going to be fantastic and then realize that actually it's not working at all. So being flexible to think, okay, what else can I do? It's okay that it's not working. I'm not going to sit them through this, or I'm not willing to manage this behavior. They're obviously not interested in this. Let's do something different. Time management. So we call that pacing in teaching. So across a lesson, getting the pace right. So it's not too fast that we're leaving kids behind. It's not too slow that they're getting bored. We're not rushing kids we're giving them enough time to do what they need to do. Having explicit goals is such an important thing for our students, and it's such an easy thing to do. It's so simple to let the students know what their goals are in a lesson. And lastly, differentiated teaching. So making sure that we're catering for the different needs of our students. Those were the ideas that students in the workshop had about the most important considerations for lesson planning. In the week 3 document, you were asked to read this document about It's a teaching framework from New South Wales. Queensland used to have a very similar one called the Productive Pedagogies, and there were 4 aspects to it. The purpose of reading this is to show you just a different example of teaching and learning frameworks that governments develop. So the New South Wales government at this time were suggesting that good teaching and learning comes from having a quality learning environment, intellectual quality, and learning having significance and links to the real world, that kind of thing. Now these kinds of frameworks come and go, they change over time. Currently in Queensland, in Education Queensland schools, not all of them, but many of them, the art and science of teaching is the main framework that's used by Mazzano. Now, I actually think that it's an excellent framework. It just covers all aspects of teaching. So this is the diagram that we often see when we're talking about, we call it ASOT, Art and Science of Teaching. So, I mean, it covers everything. The learning goals, giving kids feedback, the rules and procedures in your classroom, the different phases of learning. So when you're starting with new knowledge, when you're practicing, when you're getting to the higher order thinking skills. So, this framework is really quite comprehensive. Now, one reason I'm mentioning it to you now is that if you are in a Queensland school on your prac, you might very well hear about this because so many schools are using it. Now, Chapter 10 in this textbook has some information about lesson and unit planning. So that's what we're going to read from now. So there are 2 things you need to know for the next part. The first is what you're going to read, and the second is what I want you to do when you read it. So number 1, let's find what I want you to read now, if you haven't already. I want you to read the Mazzano extract, which is here under week 3, the Mazzano extract. Sorry that it's not terrific quality, I just took screen clippings of it. So this is from Chapter 10 of Mazzano. What will I do to develop effective lessons organised in a cohesive unit? So it's just a segment from the chapter. I've only taken the first 3 pages of it. So that's what you're going to read. Secondly, we're going to think about what I want you to do while you read it. And this is a comprehension strategy that you can use in any learning area whenever you give students a new text. So it's called Making Connections. It's a tool for interacting with new knowledge and facilitating comprehension. So let's pop back onto Blackboard. And there's a PDF here called Making Connections Strategy. So I'll go through what I'm talking about when we say making connections. Now this whole document here I've uploaded for you. Please have a look through the whole thing. There are so many fantastic resources and ideas and graphic organisers in here that you can use. They're very practical, and there's certainly an opportunity for you to use these. So making connections, it's about making meaning of texts. And we can do that in 3 ways. We can think about the text in relation to yourself, the text in relation to other texts, and the text in relation to the bigger world. Let's go through each of these. The first is text to self. And that's where we're connecting personal experience. So what does this remind me of in my life? What is this similar to in my life? How is it different from my life? Have a read of the different ones there. I'll just zoom out a little bit. So we're asking students to use their own frame of reference to help comprehend a text that they're reading. So that one's called text to self. The second one is called text to text, and that's connecting big ideas and themes across texts. So thinking, does this remind me of something I've read in another book? Is this text similar? Is it different? Have I read something like this before? And the third one is text to world. So connecting real world happenings to text. what does this remind me of in the real world? But you can see there's a pattern here. What does it remind me of? Is it similar? Is it different? Is it thinking about how things relate to students? Things that happen in the world relate to students. As you read this segment here, I want you to make a note in whatever way you can, whether it's adding a comment, whether it's highlighting it on your screen. If you've printed it out, and in the workshop I gave students who had a printed copy of it page markers. And if you read something that reminds you of something in your life, then I want you to write up here, T2T. T2S, text to self. So if you read something and think, oh, that reminds me of something that I know about, then use whatever tool you need to highlight it and note that it's T2S. If you read something that reminds you of another text that you've read, T to T. And if it reminds you of something that you know about the world, then you do T to W. So we had students in the class who had page markers all the way down the sides of the pages. So that's getting you to think about how this text fits into your frame of reference, to what you already know. Okay, so I want you to, if you haven't already read it, pause it now, pause this recording and have a read of that and see if you can have a go at making those annotations. So thinking about how this fits with yourself. If you wanted to have another look at the strategy, it's in this comprehension strategies document. So pause it now and have a go at that. Okay. If you've read that, I want you just to have a look back at the things that you've labelled and think about what it would have been like if you didn't make those connections. And we're putting ourselves into the shoes of our students and thinking about how we can help them to best interpret a text that they're reading. Now in the class we shared some of the things that we labelled, and we had some things very similar. Lots of people, we all found things across all three of the strategies, so text to self, text to text, and text to world. So I hope you had a practice of that strategy. And you can use that with your students. I'm going to give you a few other ideas of how else you could introduce a new text to students and help them comprehend it. So one is the making connection strategy. A second one is called an anticipation and reaction guide. So this is what you'll do. Before they read the text, you'll give them a table like this, where you're writing down statements that relate to the text. So for example, with the text I've just given you, I could have given you a list of statements such as teachers should teach the same lessons for the sake of consistency. So all teachers should teach in the same way. So before you read the text, you would mark whether you agree or disagree with that, and then you'll read the text. After you've read it, you'll have a think about whether you still agree or disagree, and make a page reference to wherever is appropriate. So you can use that for both fiction and non-fiction text. So it's about getting students to think before you read, and then thinking after and looking at whether or not your opinions have changed or whether you were correct or incorrect. So that's called an anticipation and reaction guide. A third one, actually there's a couple on here. You could record what students have read in a graphic organizer. So that's sort of like a note-taking strategy. There are so many graphic organisers, you can Google and get so many different ones. And the Art and Science of Teaching advocates using graphic organisers hugely. So there's a lot of resources from Mazzano as well. You could ask students to stop after they've read, or stop after each paragraph, or however often you wanted them to, and to draw a non-linguistic representation of the concepts. So whatever concept you're teaching, you can stop and get them to draw a little picture that they feel represents that concept. And that will suit some learners more than others. And quite a challenging strategy, you might use this more so in your senior year levels. Ask them to summarise what they've read in 6 words. Ernest Hemingway famously wrote, "For sale, baby shoes never worn," and that summed up his text. So I've just put a note down here that about how when students personalize information, that gets them to think much more deeply about it. So being able to summarize something in your own words really shows that you do understand it. I always say to my students, I said this in the workshop, if you can't summarize something, if you can't put it into your own words, and that will often mean that you don't understand it fully yet, so go back and learn more about it. So these are our strategies to help students process new information. This is the last one, and we did this in the class. So it's called a line-up strategy. This is for deepening knowledge, actually. It's not for a new text. Although you could use it at the start of a lesson, if you're just introducing a whole new concept, you could give students a statement that they need to respond to in this way. You could absolutely do that. So you make a statement, and then students make a physical continuum across the room. So at one end of the room, you've got, "I strongly agree with this statement," and across to the other side of the room where you strongly disagree. And you give students a statement, and they stand wherever they feel they should along that line from agree to disagree. As the teacher, you look at the midway point, you split the line, and then ask students to chat to somebody on the other side of the line and express their points of view, share why they think the way they do about that statement. So this was the statement that we used. So teachers can only do so much when it comes to catering for the individual needs of students. So we got up and we stood across the line where we felt our beliefs were, and then we chatted to somebody who might have had a slightly different point of view from us. So that's a really nice activity to get students moving, get them talking, expressing their ideas, being able to justify their ideas. Okay, so that's sort of the first part of the workshop, looking at how we can introduce new text to students and get them thinking about what they're reading. In terms of this document that you read, I hope that you got a few ideas about how we organise lessons and why we organise them the way that we do. There was quite a bit of theory in here about why we do and about teaching from textbooks and all those kinds of things. So if you're interested to read more, I've put the reference down here. It's an excellent book. I really would recommend it. Okay. This is the next activity, and this really gets into lesson planning. On Blackboard, there are two versions of the same lesson. Neither are perfect, and we're going to look at the strengths and the weaknesses of each one. So there's two things I think that you're going to need. So the lesson plan examples are here. And you're going to need the document called Lesson Plan Considerations. Okay, so please pause this and have a read of each of the lessons. Okay, so you've read the lesson plans, and you probably would have noticed that they're quite different. They're teaching the same thing, but the teachers have gone about planning for them in very different ways. Your job now will be to go through and use these kinds of considerations, as well as any others that you can think of, to assess the strengths and weaknesses of each lesson. So think about the introduction of each lesson. Is there string? By that I mean, does the lesson plan to make links to what comes before? Do they say, okay, in the last lesson we did this, and this is how today's lesson fits in with that? So you have a read down of these kinds of considerations, and you're very welcome to add your own. Okay, this is not a comprehensive list. I've made this list to kind of just sit at the concepts that we might have looked at so far in this unit, and so there are certainly more things that you could add to this. So there are lots of ways that you could go about recording your ideas about the strengths and weaknesses. This is one idea. You could record your responses in a table. So in the notes and suggestions, you could just make a comment about what you found, or make a suggestion of how the lesson could be altered to improve it. That's one option. You could do a comparison matrix where the characteristics will be the considerations. So, is there a string across the lesson? Does it cater for different learning styles? Lesson 1, Lesson 2, and then you summarize over here. Or you can do a double bubble map like this one. So we put Lesson 1 in the middle over here, Lesson 2 over here, and the things that are different go on the outsides, and the things that are similar across the lessons go through the middle here. So you can choose whichever strategy you think would work for you. And you can always give students these kinds of options. I always used to commonly offer students the opportunity to do a dot point list if they wanted to write sentences if they wanted to, or to do mind maps. Those were my 3 go-to strategies to give students a choice, and they usually got better at one of them and had a preference for one. So I'll ask you now to stop and go through those 2 lesson plans and assess them and look at the strengths and weaknesses of each one. Then neither of them are perfect, but one is certainly better planned than the other one. So go ahead and do that now. Okay, so you've done that now. I'm going to open up some of the responses from the class. So this is not a comprehensive overview of it, but it's just some responses that students came up and typed in for us. So in lesson plan 1, so that was a very brief one, there wasn't much string. The teacher didn't particularly talk about how the lesson linked with the previous lesson. So they're asking students how their day is going, and they're telling them what they need to do in the lesson, which is something. Sorry, I'm just going to resize these so I can go between them. Okay. But in lesson 2, yep, they went and checked back about the last lesson. So check in about last lesson and talked about what they looked at in the last lesson. Perhaps you might get the students to do a quick little revision activity rather than just saying this is what we did last lesson. So this is what we did last lesson. Now let's take 5 minutes to review that. So get them to reread their notes or do a practice of that skill, whatever it might be. Just do something that gets students to practice and keep it fresh for them. Establishes clear direction for the lesson. Now this is interesting. Lesson 1, it highlights lesson goals but doesn't really achieve them in detail. I'm assuming that the student meant that within the body of the lesson there's not really opportunity to achieve those, or it's not described in detail exactly how those lesson goals will be achieved. So that's a fair point of critique. In the second lesson, they're exactly the same as in the first one. There are learning goals, although there isn't any success criteria. So how do students know how to achieve these? That's not explicated. Students' prior knowledge is considered and valued. Activity 1. They're asked to think about what makes customer service good and bad. So in one way that is asking them what they already know, absolutely. You might want to give a little bit more guidance when you're doing an activity like this. It will be very easy in this kind of conversation for the students to derail you. But because we're working with a Year 10 class, lots of these students would have part-time jobs already, so they would have lots of personal experience to draw on, and they would get a real kick out of telling you about the awful customers that they've had. Down here, it's a similar idea, but students are doing something with their ideas. So they're putting them into a Y chart, which is another graphic organizer. And it's great that the teachers put some ideas, some prompts. So in case the students sit there like dead fish and have no idea what to say, you can have some ideas ready to go. Students' prior knowledge, sorry, we've done that one. Yep, so creating Y chart of the students' ideas before watching the clip validates their contributions. If the students don't give a lot, the teacher could switch the Y chart and clip around and give them examples to connect their experiences with. That's a great idea. So if the students are sitting there with blank faces, you could switch around, and that links back to being flexible. So that's a really great suggestion. Okay, during the enhancing phase of the lesson, so across the middle part, now that we've talked about what's come before, what we're doing this lesson, and checking what we already know, we move into the body of the lesson. So students are provided with the tools to record their ideas. So is there some way that students are facilitated to write down or represent in some way what they're learning? So in lesson 2, students are given the transcript to annotate and reference. So, and they're drawing a table here and given the subheadings. So there's certainly opportunity in lesson 2. Lesson 1, they're just watching and get students to think about. I mean, we really don't do that in teaching. We don't just get them to think about it. We always make sure that we're getting them to represent what they're thinking about in some way, unless it's right at the start of the lesson, like I did with this workshop and said, think to yourself for 1 minute. But when you're doing the more extended activities, you don't get them just to think about it. Always get them to write something down or tell the person next to them or whatever it might be. New skills are modelled first. In lesson 1, YouTube is used as a form of modelling language and body language. Is this enough for the modelling for the end task? That's a fair question. So up here, students watch it, but is that enough? Yeah. Is that enough to get them to write a customer service scenario? Probably not. You might want to teach them a little bit more before you send them off to do that. In lesson 2, there's an awful lot more scaffolding. Okay, completing the table together, having a discussion, doing a mind map to help students develop ideas. And then they're given more practice. So for this one, students have the opportunity to practice a new skill with more independence. Lesson 2, there is a whole section of this lesson dedicated to independent work. That's right. So we've modelled what we want students to do, given them the content, and now we're getting them to practice more independently. Tasks are logically sequenced. So for both of them, yes, they're logically sequenced, but they're not in great detail. Somebody asked, could you possibly get through all this in one lesson? And maybe you couldn't. Does it specify? No, it doesn't say how long this lesson was designed for, but if it was a 45-minute lesson, then probably not. This might be something that would take a couple of lessons. So that's a reasonable critique. A range of intelligences are catered for. Lesson 2, yes, a range of learning styles are catered for, but our ESL, yeah, so our students with different needs catered for. We might need to think about what else we could do for students, particularly if they have difficulty with spoken language. Perhaps because it's a spoken task that we're asking them to do. Perhaps we could ask them to do a written version of it instead. If they're stronger at their written English, then ask them to write it instead. Perhaps you could give them a little bit more of a structure for the scenario. So it's just adding in a little bit more and modifying what we're doing to make sure that those students still feel like they can have a go. The lesson asks students to engage in a level of thinking appropriate for the phase of the unit. Lesson 2, yes. They're right about the timing and pacing. That's right, yeah. So the level of thinking is quite good. There's some analysis of the YouTube clip that they're watching. There's some creating, which is the really high order thinking, creating, and thinking about how language is positioning the viewers. So link between learning objectives and activities. There is a link in example 1, but it's not a comprehensive link, and there isn't a whole lot of detail about how language is used to manipulate. There's no mention of body language, so yeah, this one's quite vague. The second lesson does a much better job of making a link between the two. Okay, finishing up. Feedback is given to students about their progress. So in the second lesson, teacher monitoring during the independent work is a great time for feedback. That's right. So while the students are practicing, we're visiting students as they work, clarifying, asking them questions. Okay, the Socratic questioning technique perhaps. So extending them. That doesn't happen in lesson 1 though. String is a link to the next lesson. In lesson 1, no, you're asking them what they think they learned in today's lesson, but nothing about the next lesson. And lesson 2, absolutely, look at all these wonderful questions here. Perhaps there could be a little bit more in there about, in the next lesson we're going to do this. It does make a link to the assessment though, which is always a nice thing to do. It reminds students of why today was a relevant lesson to them. And somebody's added in here the time management and pacing. Yes, so this lesson plan, remember this isn't a comprehensive lesson plan in that it doesn't have all the different columns with the resources, with the timings, all that kind of thing. I've just taken out the teaching and learning activities. But please remember on your lesson plans to put in roughly how much time you think you'll spend on each activity. All right, so that was that activity that we did. And hopefully you had a go yourself and picked up some of the same things. If you had any other ideas that you wanted to talk about, feel free to email me and we can have a chat about that. Okay, we've done that. All right, so the last task for this workshop is to design your own lesson plan for this lesson here. So we're working with Year 7 English in a unit about representing emotions in children's picture books. The lesson focus is how do picture books use symbolism to represent values, attitudes, and beliefs about family. Under the learning resources, there's a lesson plan template here. Now, again, this is not a complete template. This is one that's missing all that head-end stuff about what the unit is, what year level it is, all the stuff that goes at the top end of a lesson plan. All I've put here are the lesson objectives and then just the actual plan itself. So you're welcome to have a go at this if you'd like to, and you can always email it to me and I can give you some feedback on how your lesson plan is looking. So I'll just remind you of what the lesson plan is about. So how do picture books use symbolism? Now, you can make the lesson however long you want to. To keep consistent with assessment 1, let's say that it's a 45-minute lesson. So you've got 45 minutes to start looking at how picture books use symbolism to represent ideas. You might not get to the second part of this focus where we're looking at how symbolism represents values about family. You might need to spend a lesson just looking at how about the concept of symbolism and how symbolism works. Or you could pretend that that's what you did in the last lesson, and now you're up to the second part where you're linking symbolism to how picture books represent ideas about family. I've asked students from the workshop to send me a copy of the lesson plans that they came up with. And if I receive any of those, I've got one so far, I'll put that onto the week 3 activities. Just remember that we didn't have a great deal of time to work on this, so they're not 100% perfect lesson plans. Some students were a bit concerned about them being uploaded when they're not completed, but it might just give you an idea of some of the activities that people were coming up with to teach the concept of symbolism. But don't use them as an expert guide on how to do a lesson plan, because that wasn't the purpose of the activity, and I didn't allow enough time for that. So as I said, if you wanted to have a go at this, you're very welcome to, and you can email me and I can give you some feedback. Okay, so coming back to the end of the workshop now, so I'm hoping that you've been able to think about what goes into creating a good lesson plan and that you'll be able to design a lesson plan. There are lots and lots of different formats for a lesson plan in terms of how you set it out on the page for your assignment. So you just find something that suits you, that includes the kind of information that you would want to see on a lesson plan. If you wanted me to check your structure for your lesson plan, the template that you're using, you're very welcome to send that to me and I can let you know if that's a realistic plan for you to use. Okay, if you have any questions, just let me know. I hope this helps you for week 3.